Good evening. I'm Linda Wasenick, and I am a member both of Midway Hills Christian Church and the League of Women Voters of Dallas. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this meeting. It's being co-sponsored by the Leagues of Irving, Collin County, and Richardson. We hope you'll find it informative and interesting to hear the truth about immigration. Our goal for this program is to provide some factual information to help dispel some of the confusion and myths about immigrants and immigration. We will be passing out cards to you for you to write your questions down, and we'll collect them toward the end of the presentations to give you a chance to ask questions of our panelists. If you need help writing out the questions, Paul Wasenick is here. Paul, would you kind of wave your hand? So if anybody needs help translating, he would be happy to help you. So just hold your hand up, look for him. We have some brochures out on the table for anyone who would like them for more information about the Human Rights Initiative and also about the Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Services Program in Dallas. If you, restrooms are down the hall. If you go out that main door to the right, they'll be on the left-hand side, and there'll probably be somebody out there who would help you find them. And now I would like to introduce Patricia Munoz Elizondo, the Program Vice President for the League of Women Voters, who will introduce our panelists. Patricia.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome again. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. And remember this, while they are speaking, please write your questions down on the card when they are passed out. We will collect the cards toward the end of the presentations. And the panelists will be speaking in the following order. Callie Cohn is a native of New Jersey. She graduated summa cum laude from the University of Rochester. She has lived in Texas for nearly a decade and received her JD with honors from the University of Texas School of Law. Prior to joining the Human Rights Initiative, she worked for the American Civil Liberties Union in Dallas, where she focused on immigrant rights, policing, and LGBTQ rights. She is currently the Director of Advocacy for the Human Rights Initiative. Vanna Slaughter is a Dallas native. Vanna is the Senior Program Manager and Interim Manager for the Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigration Affairs, which was established in March 2017. Since its inception, the Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigration Affairs has overseen a community-driven plan, which was unanimously approved by the Dallas City Council in October 2018. The plan has 5 overarching goals, 26 recommendations, and over 115 strategies. It is being implemented and overseen by a team of 3 with incredible support from the various sectors in the community, including businesses, education, and nonprofit service providers. Vanna came to Welcoming Communities and Immigration Affairs after a 32-year career with Catholic Charities, where she was Director of Immigration and Legal Services. As a tireless advocate for non-citizens in their immigration legal matters, Vanna has served on local and state committees as a non-attorney member. Vanna has served on local and statewide committees as a non-attorney member, and she was appointed by the Texas Supreme Court for 6 years on the Texas Grievance Oversight Committee. Prior to working in the immigration field, Vanna worked in overseas development in South America, with Catholic Relief Services. She holds a master's degree in social work and is a licensed clinical social worker. Rebecca Acuña is a director of government affairs for PepsiCo, where she represents the global portfolio of food and beverage brands before public policy makers and opinion leaders in 7 states. Prior to joining PepsiCo, she was executive director of the Latino Center for Leadership Development, a national leadership organization that creates a pipeline of policy makers and thought leaders. Rebecca has also served in the leadership roles in political campaigns, federal and state government in Washington, D.C. and in Texas. Rebecca has served as Chief of Staff and Communications Director for 3 members of the Texas House of Representatives and 1 member of Congress. She was the first Latina tapped as statewide press secretary for a gubernatorial campaign in Texas. Rebecca is committed to civic engagement and the political inclusion of women and people of color. She serves on the board of the League of Women Voters of Dallas, Ignite Texas, the Child Care Group of Dallas, and the Workforce Solutions of Greater Dallas. She was born in Mexico and raised in Laredo, Texas. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Texas at Austin. She was a beneficiary of DACA and became a naturalized citizen in 2018. Joan Ridley is our monitor. She is a past program vice president of the League of Women Voters of Dallas. And I will hand it over right now to the moderator.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay. All right. We already have some. No, cannot hear me?
Speak up.
How's that? Is that better? Okay. Now each of you is going to make a presentation. Is that right? Okay. Would you like to go first, Callie?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. We're going to hear from each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions. We're handing out index cards now, so you have questions or you think you will, take an index card, and then we'll collect them later. And after all our panelists have made their presentations, then we'll pose the question.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Callie Cohn. I'm here from Human Rights Initiative in North Texas. We are a local legal and social services provider here in Dallas. We serve people fleeing persecution from all over the world, and we help with asylum cases, special immigrant juvenile cases for unaccompanied kids, and U-visa petitions and VAWA petitions for people fleeing crime and domestic violence. So I've been asked to talk to you all today a little bit about the immigration system as a whole and how asylum fits into it. So that's a big thing to cover in 25 minutes. So we're going to do sort of a quick and dirty of a few things and talk a little bit about the context in the current moment. So an overview of the system. So when people talk about immigration, when we hear about immigration. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in the way. Thank you. Okay. Don't want to do like shadow puppets. Okay. So when we talk about the immigration system, a lot of times what we hear about in the news is a conversation about citizenship, who's going to be eligible for citizenship, and that is a really small piece, although an incredibly important piece of our immigration system. So I think it's easiest to think about coming to the United States as sort of this sort of 3 boxes. So when we think of citizenship, that's permanent residence. That is something that means that you are a citizen of the country. You can come and go as you please, and you can live here indefinitely. Citizenship. Those same things are also available to legal permanent residents, green card holders. The rights available to citizens include the right to vote, which a green card holder does not have the right to do, so they're not equivalent statuses, but they are both permanent statuses, meaning that a person can come and go from the United States indefinitely as much as they please, and they can live here indefinitely. They do not have to leave. So that's this box right here, permanent legal status. And that captures much of the conversation when we're talking about immigration. People are talking often about what they think is this box. In fact, most of the people who are coming in and out of the United States on a regular basis are coming through the second way, through temporary legal status. So has anybody ever gotten a visa to go to another country? Okay, so maybe you got a tourist visa, maybe you got a business visa, maybe you got a student visa. Those are all types of temporary visas from other countries. We have equivalent visas here in the United States, and they allow people to come in and out of the United States, but they're different than this box here because a person cannot stay indefinitely. When you get one of those visas, you have to promise that you're intending to leave the country. That's the big difference. So we have these two boxes, permanent legal status and temporary legal status. To get permanent legal status, most people have to adjust through some family-based relationship. Most people have to get that status through some family-based relationship or some employment relationship. And so not everyone who wants to come to the United States is going to be eligible for this permanent legal status. And many people who want to come to the United States are not going to be eligible for a temporary legal status either. So the third box of folks that are coming to the United States are people who do not have legal status. And so when we see the news about folks presenting themselves on the southern border looking to claim asylum, those are people that are not being admitted into the United States because they don't have a visa that's been pre-approved that says that they can come in. So if they had a visa, they might have temporary status, or they might have a green card or their passport to indicate they're citizens. They don't have that, and so they're not able to enter the country. So these are our three sort of boxes. Now, people can adjust sometimes from temporary status to permanent legal status. Again, it's usually through an employer relationship or a family relationship. So a lot of people who have temporary visas have no way to adjust to permanent status. But some people do, and so when you hear people talking about adjusting to permanent status, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about moving from this temporary box to this permanent box. The really tough thing is that if you're here in the United States and you do not have legal status, generally speaking, it is very difficult. Most people cannot adjust. Most people don't have that line to adjust. And so the question is there some way for somebody who's in the United States to move from this box of no legal status into temporary or permanent legal status? For most people, the answer is no. There is no way to hop that box when somebody is here in the United States. We do have a couple of exceptions. One is humanitarian provisions under our immigration laws. So after World War II, many countries came together. They said, never again are we going to send people who are fleeing their persecutors back to their persecutors. And so that was where our humanitarian laws came out of here in the United States. Started with asylum, which we're here to talk about this evening. Those are not our only humanitarian protections under our immigration laws. We also have protections available for kids who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned by one or both of their parents. We have humanitarian protections under the Violence Against Women Act for women who are, or for women or men who are married to green card holders or U.S. citizens and are trapped in that relationship because of domestic violence. We have humanitarian provisions that have been advocated for and developed by law enforcement, our U-Visa program, which gives a pathway to legal status for people who have been victims and witnesses to certain types of crimes, to encourage people to come forward and report those crimes. At HRI, we serve primarily folks who have been, who have survived domestic violence, sexual assault, and incest. But there are many other qualifying crimes under that law. And then finally, a T-Visa program, which is available to trafficking survivors. So there are other humanitarian protections under our immigration law other than asylum. But we're here to talk about asylum tonight. But that is one way that someone who does not have legal status can obtain temporary or permanent legal status. So to give you an idea of sort of what this looks like from a numbers standpoint, this is everybody who in fiscal year 2017 adjusted to permanent residency. So everybody who got a green card. All of these little guys in gray, those are people who went through, usually, for the most part, some family-based or employment-based way. That's how they moved between the boxes. These down here, in the purple, the blue, and the red, these are people who adjusted because of one of these humanitarian programs. So what we're talking about is a very small fraction of people who are ultimately able to become green card holders and then U.S. citizens because of these protections, but people who very much need safety in the United States. So it's a little bit of a frame to think about how we're going to talk about asylum. So I think we hear in the news a lot things that make it sound like asylum is very easy to get, that you don't have to prove very much, and that is far, far from reality. So asylum is a legal standard, and you have to prove with evidence that you meet the legal standard. So the legal standard in the United States under our law is that you can't go home because of past persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. So you have to prove that. You have to prove that you have been persecuted or you're pretty sure you will be. And you don't just prove that. You have to prove why. So you have to prove that the persecution was because of your race, because of your religion, because of your nationality, because of your political opinion, or because of your membership in a particular social group. The last is sort of a way to protect people who may be in a situation in their country where they're a part of a social group that is persecuted in that country. So a good example of this is that many of our clients who are fleeing countries where LGBTQ people are persecuted, their claim of asylum may be because of their sexual orientation or because of their gender identity and their membership in that social group in their country. So these are the bases. And this isn't it. This isn't all you have to prove. You also have to prove that this persecution was done by the government or someone the government was unable or unwilling to control. So that's persecution because of one of 5 things by the government or someone they were unable to control. So as you can imagine, it is very difficult for someone who is fleeing their home to have proof of all of these things, right? So for example, we had a client who fled from Sudan. He was a political activist. He was working against the Janjaweed militia there that was perpetrating genocide, and he fled internally within the country several times. Was threatened many times. At one point, he went to a refugee camp. At one point, he went to Khartoum, came back home, was doing work there, and then some militia members visited him in the night, beat him, and decided not to kill him at that moment and told him they were going to be back tomorrow, and if he was still there, he would die. And so he fled in the night and left with as much as he could. But that is the circumstance of many people who are fleeing to the United States to try to claim asylum, to try to claim safety here. And they are charged with proving all of these things based on whatever evidence they can muster before immigration court. So it's a very difficult standard to meet. I think it's easiest to sort of think through how this might play out with some examples. So I'm going to have you raise your hand if you think somebody qualifies for asylum, and then if you think they don't qualify for asylum. So the first example, Florence, a lesbian woman, fled Tanzania after she was arrested by police at an LGBTQ pride event, and while detained, tortured for allegedly recruiting people into the, quote, gay and lesbian lifestyle. Who thinks that this person might qualify for asylum? Who thinks this person might not qualify for asylum? Okay, so this person, a lesbian woman, fled Tanzania, an attorney doing sort of country conditions research is what we call it, would be able to show the court that in Tanzania, LGBTQ people are persecuted by the government, and so she is part of a protected social group. She was arrested by police, so we have the government in action, and she was detained and tortured, which is persecution. So she would qualify. Okay, so what about this example? Adela came to the U.S. from Iraq, where she fled because her family was being threatened by a local religious sect for refusing to participate. It was reported to the police. The police stopped the threats. Okay, who thinks she would qualify for asylum? Who thinks she would not? Okay, so she would not. She was persecuted on the basis of one of those 5 reasons, right? Religion. But she reported to the police and the police stopped it. So it wasn't by the government, and the government was able to control that group. And so she would not qualify for asylum, even though she was persecuted in her home country because of one of those 5 reasons. Okay, last example. Marie came to the U.S. after fleeing Cameroon, where she was tortured by security agents after her arrest for participating in a protest about the government's tax policy. She traveled to the U.S. through Canada. She stayed there 2 weeks, and then she crossed the Canada-New York border. Do we think she qualifies for asylum? Do we think she doesn't qualify for asylum? Okay, so Marie was tortured. She was persecuted by security agents, by the government, because of participating in a protest, so because of her political opinion. So it seems like she should qualify. But this is a little wrinkle. We have an agreement with Canada called the Safe Third Country Agreement that says that if you get to Canada first, you have to seek asylum there. If somebody gets to the U.S. first and goes to Canada, they have to seek asylum here. So even though Marie has met the standard, right? She's been persecuted by a government official on the basis of one of those 5 grounds, she would still not qualify for asylum in the United States because she came to the U.S. and through Canada. So this is a quick example of how complicated this can be for folks. There are many people who have survived really horrible circumstances and are coming to the United States fleeing for safety that may not qualify for asylum because of the way that our law is structured or because they cannot prove their claim. So I think that's important to know because there's lots of conversation about sort of like all these fake asylum claims. And it's important to understand that people are fleeing very real persecution. And this standard here is a very difficult standard to meet. If we look at the folks who are winning asylum cases, about 50% of people who have lawyers and are seeking asylum win, about 20% of people without lawyers win. So it's really also important that people have access to attorneys. And unlike in the criminal defense context, where someone who is charged with a crime would be eligible for a public defender if they could not afford one, in the immigration context, it's a no-go. If you can't afford an attorney, you don't get one. And so it's very important that we have free legal services available for folks. One last sort of process note, just to understand sort of how things work. So a person who has never come into contact with the immigration system in a negative way. So for example, somebody who they came on a temporary visitor visa, and then something happened at home and they were like, I cannot go home. That person would seek affirmative asylum. It's basically an administrative process. You would submit an application with all of your evidence in paper, affidavits, photographs, medical reports, whatever you can compile, and it would be heard by an asylum officer in the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Department. So sort of an administrative process. This process right now for folks, depends on where people end up in a backlog, but can be as long as 4 to 5 years to get this interview. If you get this interview and it's granted, fabulous. Now you're granted asylum. We'll see what that looks like in a minute. If you're not, then you go to immigration court, and then you get to actually have your case heard by an immigration court judge who may or may not act like a prosecutor at your hearing. They usually function in sort of that capacity. They are members of the Department of Justice. They are not an independent court. And you would have your case heard by the immigration court. So that process right now, court dates for people who are not detained are being scheduled in 2021. So again, if you're having to go through this whole process, it's a very long wait, and we frequently have clients who are denied asylum at this stage and then granted asylum before an immigration judge, even here in Dallas, where our denial rates are much higher than the rest of the country. So this is a very lengthy and very difficult process for folks to get through. If someone does get through the process, this is an example of how long it could take. So you're going to file your asylum application, or you're in court and you say you want to seek asylum. The good news is, unlike any of the other humanitarian protections under our law, for asylees, after 180 days, you can get work authorization. For the other clients that we serve, like folks fleeing domestic violence or unaccompanied kids who have been waiting years and years for their applications that are still waiting, that work authorization isn't approved until they get here. So the good news for our asylum clients is that it's a long 180 days with no way to work and no way to pay any bills, but it is 180 days. And then we're seeing clients wait anywhere from a year to 4 years to 5 years right now just to get their application approved. If their application is approved, they have a year waiting period, and that's when they can apply for their green card. So when we're talking about people sort of getting through this process and being able to be legal permanent residents, that first box that we talked about at the beginning, for many people, that can be 6 years down the road. It could be shorter for some people, it could be longer for some people, but it's a long process. And then for asylees, it's 4 more years until they can apply for citizenship. So the road to citizenship is a long one. So this all assumes that the asylum system is at least working as well it was working 3 years ago. And there were many, many problems with the system 3 years ago. The backlog is not a new problem. It has gotten worse, but it's certainly not new. But the administration has been working very hard to make all of these things very difficult to access. I left at the front a paper that's sort of a timeline about some of the policy changes that have happened over the past 2 years to try to chip away at these rights. This is just a handful of things. The original list that I compiled of everything would have probably been 4 or 5 pages like that. So it's a small example. The ones that are really important to understand today are these 4: metering, remain in Mexico, the transit ban, and the safe third country agreement. So we're going to talk about each of those. So the first is metering. So last year, we, the American people, started hearing reports that Customs and Border Protection wasn't letting everybody who needed to claim asylum through the ports of entry at the southern border. So the reports started coming out of particular ports and then sort of traveled throughout the border. And what folks were hearing was that they were saying, you know what, we're only going to let in 50 people today here, or we're only going to let in 100 people today here, or we're only going to let 5 people in here. It depended on the port of entry you were at, and it was not a written policy, and so the number wasn't always the same. This was called metering. The government's justification for this was that it could not absorb the number of people who were wanting to claim asylum in the United States. The practical result of that was that every day they would send people back who were in excess of the number that they had chosen for the day, and sent those people back to Mexico to wait to try to come tomorrow. That means that those folks did not have any way to prove that they had tried to come to the border to say that they needed to seek asylum. They had no access to any process here in the United States. They were just denied the ability to present themselves at the border to claim asylum, which is a right for someone who's fleeing persecution under our laws. What ended up happening is people sort of informally started creating lists on paper, and were sort of managing this giant list on the other side of the border. There were stories about things like, I think one of the lists was taken, nobody knew where it was, everybody had to start back over again. So it was not a system, but that's what the United States was implementing. So the first thing was metering, basically not letting very many people through. The second thing that was implemented at the beginning of this year and was has been tied up in litigation for a long time but is now fully in effect is the government's Remain in Mexico program. It's also called MPP, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, more aptly the Migrant Persecution Protocols. And that policy basically says that once you finally get through the line, right, so you've waited however long you needed to wait until your number came up because of our metering program. Now you've gotten here, and we're going to say, great, we took your name down, and we're going to give it to an immigration judge, and we'll let you know when you have to come back here for your hearing. In the meantime, you have to stay in Mexico. This was not in place at all of the ports of entry in the United States. It's been rolling out slowly to different ports of entry. In Texas, it's currently in place in Brownsville, Laredo, and El Paso. People are being required to stay in the cities across the border from those cities, particularly the folks who are trying to get through the Laredo port of entry are in very serious danger. Human Rights First and other national organizations that do human rights work have been going to the border to try to collect stories about what's going on. There are very regular reports of kidnappings, rape, all sorts of horrific crimes and exploitation of folks who are sitting, waiting, trying to access asylum at that port of entry. So that is now rolled out, and what we are seeing as a practical effect of that is that less people are able to enter the United States to try to claim asylum, which means we saw that number before, how much more successful people are when they're trying to seek asylum, when they have an attorney versus when they don't. And folks are being trapped across the border without access to attorneys. They're also having to make it across the border for their court date, which can sometimes be impossible. Oftentimes means someone traveling from sort of a close by town to the port of entry. And we've heard stories about people showing up and then, their date isn't actually current, all sorts of things. It's a very difficult way. It is, well, that's an understatement. It is a way to make asylum virtually inaccessible for people who are trying to seek it on the southern border. I will note this program is not in place on our northern border. The next thing that the administration did was it passed this thing called an interim final rule. It's basically very complicated, unnecessary administrative law, but basically when the agencies that report to the executive want to do stuff, they promulgate rules, and usually it goes through this notice and comment period. If you've heard about that, the public gets a chance to weigh in on, how this rule will affect them. This is a process where you get to sidestep that notice and comment period, and the rule goes into place immediately. So this rule went into place immediately without notice and comment. The notice and comment period and opened later, which is why this exists. But the rule turns people who are coming to the southern border and have traveled through one other country to get here back to that country or back to their country they originally came from. We're not yet sure how it will be implemented. Basically, it says that if you didn't get asylum in some other country you traveled through, then you're barred from seeking asylum here in the United States. You have to go back to that country and see if you would qualify, and then once you're denied there, you can come to the United States. This is really designed to target folks who are traveling from the Northern Triangle up through Central America to the U.S. southern border. The systems that are in place to adjudicate asylum claims in those places are not in any way able to absorb the caseload that they're looking for. I think I was looking at the data a couple of weeks ago, and it's there were less than 1,000 cases adjudicated in, I think, 2 of the countries combined last year. So the countries are not equipped to deal with asylum claims, and most people we have clients, we have examples of clients who have tried to do that, who have gone through those countries and tried to seek asylum and have not been successful there and have been successful here. So this is functionally designed just to deny access to asylum for folks who are traveling up through the southern border. So now, if somebody gets through the metering process, so they waited in line, And then they're stuck in Mexico waiting for their court hearing. They manage to show up at their court hearing. They don't have a lawyer. The question is going to be, well, did you travel through another country to get here? Well, did you seek asylum there? And if the answer is no, sorry, you're done. So this has made asylum virtually impossible to access through the U.S. southern border. The last thing that I'll mention is the Safe Third Country Agreement that we talked about earlier, is with Canada because we have an agreement with Canada that we believe that both places are equally as safe for folks who are trying to seek asylum. The administration has been working to try to expand Safe Third Country Agreements to Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and I believe there was recent news of trying to do this with Panama. Some of those agreements are technically in place. None of them are in effect because of different things that the other country must do to make sort of that policy go into effect. So we have not yet seen sort of the practical impact of what those types of agreements would do, but the wheels are in motion for those agreements to come into place, meaning that if somebody came here and traveled there first, they would get sent back there. So we have 2 minutes. I will say that what we've covered is just like a fraction of the difficulties that someone who is trying to access asylum here in the United States is facing. This is a really awesome graphic that was put together by grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees about the different barriers that people face when they come to seek asylum in the United States. What we really talked about are these things before entry, right? So somebody who's trying to get through the southern border, what happens to them when they're trying to get here? If they are able to get into the United States, there are more barriers. It is not an easy ride. We have, and I can't talk about all of these, but I'll just give a couple examples. One is that the administration has made it harder for people to pass what's called a credible fear interview, which is sort of a prerequisite for being able to ask for asylum. It's a policy decision to try to make the numbers go down. In immigration court, the administration has placed really severe requirements on immigration courts in terms of how quickly they need to close cases. I heard this described as life or death decisions being made in a traffic court context, and I think that's the best description that I can think of what's going on in immigration court. I'll mention also that the Attorney General is sort of like the Supreme Court of immigration courts. So they're part of the Department of Justice. They ultimately report to the head of the Department of Justice, so the Attorney General. You can't appeal it out of there up to the federal appellate courts. That's a very expensive process. Most people cannot do that. So for practical purposes, the final decision maker for most cases is the Attorney General. And so the immigration sort of case law is subject to the whims of that person. The Attorney General has tried to make it much more difficult for women fleeing domestic violence to become eligible for asylum, for people who are members of a particular family group that is persecuted where they're from, has tried to make it more difficult for those folks to access asylum. So there are all sorts of things that are happening to make it very difficult to access asylum. And the last thing that I'll mention is that even if someone is able to pass this process, the immigration detention has ramped up, and so people are oftentimes not able to bond out, and so are awaiting this entire process in detention. So it's a very quick description of what's going on with the asylum system. I'm happy to answer any other questions, and I will turn it over back over here.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Vanna Slaughter, and it's so wonderful to be here in this sacred space. I can remember in the 80s and 90s with Reverend Frank Mabey being here for so many wonderful events as we worked with the Central American refugee crisis during those years. I was on the board of Proyecto Adelante during those years, in addition to working at Catholic Charities, and Midway Hills Christian Church was a very, very, very important player, and so it's an honor to be back here today. It's really bringing up a lot of memories in my mind kind. Could I ask you all, how many of you have heard about the City of Dallas's Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs? Wow, okay, that's great. Usually when we're out and about, and we're out in the community a lot, doing a lot of community engagement, very, very few hands go up. So happy to know that a few of you know about our office. I want to go back in time and just acquaint you with the history of the formation of this office. I can remember, and I was talking to Linda Wassenich earlier, and I'm sure she was around the table. Other members of the League of Women Voters I know were around the table. Julie Lowenberg, Cheryl Pullman, and many, many others. About 15 years ago, we had an effort when Mayor Tom Leppert was the mayor of the city of Dallas. Many of us had decided that it was high time that Dallas have an office dedicated to immigrant and refugee affairs. The city of Houston had formed one in 2001, and Dallas was kind of lagging behind. We formed this coalition, and the artist Dahlia Woods came on board, and she created and designed a logo for us, and we called ourselves One Voice. And I think it was around 2001, 2003, something like that. But we met for about 18 months trying to influence leaders in the city of Dallas to form an Office of Immigrant Affairs, because many cities around the country were doing that at the time. Cannon Flowers was around the table. Liz Cedillo Pereira, my boss right now, was around the table. And we worked and we worked and we worked for about 18 months, meeting every month at the Center for Nonprofit Management. And it never went anywhere. After about 18 months, Mayor Leppert went on to run for the U.S. Senate, and we lost contact with a lot of people that we were working with at City Hall, and we just abandoned our efforts, we thought. I like to think that we planted a little seed at that time that took a long time to germinate, but after the elections in 2016, it sort of organically took place, the formation of this office. The Mayor's Task Force on Poverty issued a report in December of 2016 recommending that the city of Dallas, due to the changing demographics in the city of Dallas, establish an Office of Immigrant Affairs. And in January, as many of you I'm sure will remember, the travel ban took place at DFW Airport, where many dozens of Muslim travelers from Muslim countries, from Islamic countries, were stranded at the DFW Airport. Mayor Mike Rawlings at the time was quite perplexed over the situation, and the only thing he knew to do at the time was to go out there to the airport with dozens of bouquets of white roses and offer them to the families who were stranded at DFW, just saying, this is not who Dallas is. Please, I'm the mayor of Dallas. Please do not take this away, that Dallas is not a welcoming city. So those two things, the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty recommendations, together with the travel ban that occurred in January of 2017, led to kind of the organic, overnight formation of our office, which I have been very privileged to be a part of since March of 2017. I had recently retired from Catholic Charities, serving 32 years as the director of the Legal Services program there, and my dear friend who had worked for me at Catholic Charities, Liz Cedillo Pereira, returned to Dallas from working in the Obama administration. I ran into her at church one Sunday and I said, I'm retired. And she said, no, you're not. You're coming with me. I need your help. The mayor has tapped me and asked me to stand up this office. And so I volunteered for about 9 months with her, and then it led to a budget and it led to the formation of the office. And I've been there since the very beginning, and I'm very proud to say that we now have this office that I think is going to be performing in many, many, many years to come. I may not be there for many, many years to come, but the office is there, and it's very, very important, and I think very symbolic that Dallas is a welcoming city. Dallas is not the city of hate that it was so for many years accused of being. I have family members from the East Coast who used to confront me as I was a child growing up, why is Dallas such a city of hate after the very, very unfortunate assassination of President Kennedy. But I think that we are a new city, we're a different city, and the institution of this city of welcoming, this Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs is testament to that. And I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about what we have done since the formation of the office. Early on, Liz, in her, did tremendous foresight and leadership. She wanted to do a survey. We did a survey of all the people that we both knew over our many years of experience who have worked in immigrant and refugee affairs. We did a survey of those people, asking them what they thought the most pressing issues were confronting immigrants and refugees. We compiled those results, and from those results we formed on December 15th, 2017, obviously a terrible date to form a task force, but December 15th, 2007, we asked people to come forward. We asked 95 people that we knew were very engaged in immigrant and refugee affairs to come forward for a meeting. 85 of those 95 came out and attended this meeting at the Dallas Public Library, and they committed themselves to being an informal task force for this office to forge forward within the next 12 months to articulate a strategic plan for welcoming Dallas. And these 85 people stuck to it for 12 months, meeting individually in 5 focus areas in 5 different subgroups. And they met and they researched and they talked to people in the community. And at the end of those 12 months, they had articulated a Welcoming Dallas strategic plan, which is on the City of Dallas website on our webpage. And that is our focus area. We have 128 recommendations across about 13 different strategic areas that we're trying to implement right now. And I'm so proud of that effort. If you'd have ever told me 20 years ago that this would have happened in Dallas, I wouldn't have believed you. But it really did. These 85 people stuck with it, and they're still with us, supporting us and helping us in all kinds of strategic ways. We initially had no budget. For about 6 months, we were sort of parasitically operating off of another department of Dallas that was very generous to us. And I've got to say, every door that we have knocked on in the city of Dallas has been abundantly welcoming and generous to us in terms of sharing resources, sharing staff, sharing human resources, material resources. And if you'd have ever told me that would happen in Dallas, all these years that I worked in this subject area, I would have never believed it. But we have been welcomed with welcoming arms in any door that we've knocked on in the city of Dallas. And we couldn't have come as far as we have come had it not been for the goodwill of other departments and the welcoming nature within the city that we have received every place we've knocked on. We're a tiny staff of 3 full-time people, and we have, with the welcoming task force that I mentioned of 85 people, we have really, I think, forged ways through the city of Dallas, in the infrastructure of the city of Dallas, that I'm very, very, very proud of. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we are most proud of. One of the initiatives that Liz was very, very devout about is to establish a citizenship services program. And last year, the City Council unanimously adopted a citizenship grant program to our nonprofit partners in the City of Dallas who are helping us promote and ensure that the 47,000, there are 47,000 individuals in the city of Dallas who are lawful permanent residents who are eligible to become naturalized at this time. That's a very high number for a city the size of Dallas compared to other cities. They don't have nearly as many people who are eligible to become citizens that have not yet chosen to do that. So we want to chip away at that 47,000 number, And today at our table, I don't know exactly where it is, but we have literature about a workshop that we're hosting on November 9th of this year. We need help in getting the word out about the event, and we also need volunteers to help at the event. It's a very wonderful event to come out and help lawful permanent residents apply for citizenship. And so I encourage you all to think about either being volunteers or at least helping us get the word out about the event on November 9th. There are brochures at the table that we have today. Another very, in fact, more controversial project that Liz was very insistent upon proposing to the City Council, and likewise they unanimously approved, was a civil legal services program for immigrants who are wrapped up in the removal process that Callie just told you all about. And thank you, Callie, for that premier introduction to removal proceedings. She did a great job. The City Council unanimously approved a $100,000 fund to provide nonprofit service providers such as Human Rights Initiative funds to provide legal representation to immigrants who are wrapped up in this removal process that she talked about. Beyond that, because the City Council appropriated these public funds for civil legal representation, the Vera Institute of Justice, which is located in New York City, they have approached us and said, we will match those funds, because Dallas was so courageous in appropriating public funds. So we now have a fund of $200,000 that the Vera Institute of Justice is going to be implementing this program. The Vera Institute of Justice is going to be selecting a grantee here in the city of Dallas that will take the $200,000 of funding and provide civil legal representation in these removal proceedings that Callie spoke about. So that's something that we're hugely proud of, and had you told me 10 years ago that this would happen in the city of Dallas, I wouldn't believe you. We're also monitoring the issue of refugee resettlement in the city of Dallas. Dallas has been renowned nationally for the excellent best practices that it has adhered to in welcoming refugees to the city of Dallas. Because of our robust economy, because of the jobs available in the city of Dallas, because of the relatively low cost of housing in the city of Dallas, and the abundantly experienced refugee resettlement providers that exist in the city of Dallas. Dallas has been renowned as a place all over the country for refugee resettlement. Under the administration's current recommendations for refugee resettlement in the year to come, only 18,000 refugees will be received in the U.S., according to the current consultation that is going on. And on top of that low number, the last year of the Obama administration, 110,000 refugees were included in the ceiling. 18,000, 110,000. I mean, it's very, very worrisome that the U.S. is not standing up to its responsibility worldwide in receiving refugees. But on top of that, there is an added measure that the administration has claimed under an executive order that requires both the state officials as well as the local officials to agree that refugees should come to the localities in Texas. So we're monitoring that, we're watching it very, very carefully, and it's very, very worrisome to us. The beacon that Texas, and in particular Dallas, has been in welcoming refugees, that we will play a de minimis role in refugee resettlement, is very, very concerning to us. We're also watching very carefully, I'm sure you've heard in the news, the public charge rule that has been proposed by the administration. On Friday, there was a federal injunction against the rule taking place, but it would totally revamp the considerations involved in someone overcoming the charge of public charge in terms of their being able to immigrate to the United States. It's a very, very, very complicated area. I'm not going to get into it very much, but what the impact that it has had is a huge chilling effect in the immigrant and refugee community, where they are afraid of accepting even benefits that don't fall under this rule. There's this chilling effect that people are feeling and contacting their caseworkers in various public benefit organizations and saying, I want to turn in my card. I don't want to accept any more public benefits, whether it's food assistance or Medicaid or whether it's whatever it is, even for U.S. citizen children. So the impact that this whole issue has had on the immigrant community is that immigrants and refugees, whether or not they're eligible for the benefits or not, they're turning in their benefit cards and refusing to accept the benefits, even though they're perfectly eligible for them and it won't impact their status. So that is a huge area that we're monitoring. There is vast litigation on all of these areas that I just spoke about, and we're monitoring that. And it is like every single day as I said, we're only 3 full-time staff in this office, and you can imagine all of these different areas that not necessarily have a lot of overlap. They're all kind of unique issue areas that we're monitoring and following. It's a huge, huge, huge undertaking, but I'm proud to be there, and I'm really proud to be here with you all this evening, and I look forward to all of your questions that you might have. So thank you for listening to me. It's wonderful to be here again.
Hi, good evening. So I'm really excited to be here. I wanted to clarify one small thing that is in my bio. I was not a DACA recipient, but only because it didn't exist yet when I needed it. I would have been. So I want to, the two panelists prior talked about numbers. They discussed the path, who is eligible, who is not. And I will give you some numbers on DACA, but I also just wanted to get you to think about this. I wanted to tell you a story, and I'll choose to tell you my story. I grew up in Laredo, Texas. I came to the U.S. from Mexico when I was 6. I grew up very similar to the way many of you grew up. I went to the public library with my mom because we still didn't have cell phones or internet, or I went to the Boys and Girls Club where I learned to swim. I took tennis classes in high school. And how many of you have been to Laredo? Wow. Why? What did you notice about Laredo? What does the community look like? What are the demographics like for friends who've been there? Mostly Hispanic. Somebody guess a percentage. More than 95%. It is Webb County is one of the least diverse counties in the country. Now, because of that, I had the unique experience of never really thinking about my immigration status because everybody looked like me. All of the cops and all of the teachers and all of the students. So I had a different experience. It wasn't really until high school, my junior year of high school, I took a lot of AP classes, and there came the opportunity when the counselor said to us, hey, why don't you start taking classes at the local university or the local community college so that you can get dual credit? All my friends did. I took the application home to my parents, and at the very top, it asked, and this is what every undocumented person hates, if the doors close before you even open it, the first thing, what is it? What did they used to ask for? Your social security number. And that's really when it clicked, right there. Mom, Dad, what's mine? They're like, well, so that suddenly there was something tangible that I wasn't going to be able to do. I was not going to be able to take English at the community college. I was not going to take math or algebra 1 at the community college. And then I really started to think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do next year? And no idea. I really didn't. Then something that to me seemed like a miracle, but to people like you who are very civically engaged, happened. The summer before my senior year of high school, what happens in odd-numbered years in June? What usually finishes? Legislative sessions. So my mom walks in my room and says, Rebecca, I saw it on Univision. They passed some law. You can go to college. It's like, they passed some law, like just like that. Somebody passed some law. So because of that, I got to continue my education at the University of Texas in Austin, becoming, at this point, Texas had become the first state in the whole country to adopt an in-state tuition law. And I was just looking at the witness testimony prior to coming up here. It was the teachers groups, it was the business groups, it was the chambers of commerce, it was the ACLU, it was the civil rights organizations, all of these people, and I'm reading through those, and I recognize some of these names, and I just thought, I have to write these individuals letters of how they've changed my life. So I want us in this room who are very civically engaged to get one thing out of your head. That's never going to happen. We've heard that a lot. And this is how DACA came to be. That fall, the next fall, about fall of 2002, I was one of the first groups of people, the term dreamer didn't exist yet, that got to continue higher education in public universities and public colleges under an in-state tuition law. First it was Texas, then California, then a few states started coming in. But in the beginning, there were very few of us. And I never told anybody. I was told never to talk about it. One day, it's on the cover of the Daily Texan. There was somebody had written a piece, outraged. Did you know that there are 22 illegal alien students that are in this university? And I was like, oh my gosh, they're talking about me. Why are they talking about me? I'm just minding my own business. But then the second thing I thought was, wait, there are other people? I had no idea. So what started to happen is a few of us began to meet. We began, and the first step was, how do we get other students to apply to college under this law? Because what happens when you're the first one? You can't ask anyone for help. No one's ever done this process before. So a group of us started meeting with teachers and counselors, started traveling the state, and we started to talk to them and their students about how you apply to school as an undocumented student. What do you do when they ask you for the Social Security number? Did you know that you're eligible for state aid, but no, you cannot fill the regular FAFSA form and ignore where it tells you to send it? And we started talking to the universities to change some of their policies. They soon created the Texas application for student aid. They started to accept different forms of identification in order to get your student ID card. We created this FAQ and a guide based on our own experiences. Then something else started to happen with the years. What do you think that is? More students, and at the same time, when it passed in 2001, there's something very important. It passed in June 2001, before September 2001. When it passed, this law was non-controversial. It passed in nearly unanimous. It passed with only 3 members out of 150 members in the Texas House of Representatives voting no, with 0 senators voting no. It was signed by a Republican governor. There was nothing controversial about it. Suddenly, it was a very different picture. So we started to see this legislation threaten to get repealed. And at this point, we were students in university. It was literally about the next semester. Will we be able to come back? And that's how we started to take it from telling people how you apply to college to here's how you go talk to your lawmakers. Here's how you testify at a committee. Why don't you invite your teachers and your professors? Why don't you talk about how this has changed your life? Now, what happens? What's supposed to happen in 4 years, but takes some people 5, 6, or 7 years? Graduation. So we had cleared the first obstacle, which was getting to college, then graduating to college. And some of us graduating with debt. And now there was something else. Even though we had been paying tuition, and I just finally paid off my student loans last year. So I'm talking about, yes, paying money into the system, paying tuition. There was nothing for students to do afterwards. So that turned into advocacy at the federal level. And this advocacy centered around a piece of legislation called the DREAM Act. And it stood for Developmental Relief and Education Act for Alien Minors. And originally this was a bill by a Democrat, Dick Durbin, and a Republican from Utah. Does anyone remember? Orrin Hatch. Very liberal. Not really. Again, nonpartisan issue. Okay, what happened? Nothing. Whatever happens with Congress, nothing. Right? But students like myself, and then younger and younger students, who just, this was our everyday. We kept pushing. And we talked about working, but before I talked about how DACA happens, think of something you do every single day. What if you are driving? Maybe you didn't stop the full 3 seconds at a stop sign and you treated it like a yield sign. Maybe I do that. And you get pulled over. And you don't have a driver's license. That leads to questions. What about if you are a freshman in college and you look still really young and you go see a movie and it's rated R and they ask you for your ID and you can't see a movie? What about if you're going to celebrate your 21st birthday with your parents and you can't get a beer? So can you get on a plane? Can you can you pay for things? Can you open a bank account? So, of course, relief from deportation is the most important thing, and as is being able to work legally. But this impacts your life, just little everyday things that everybody here does. So finally, organizing and individuals, not just students, but individuals like you, individuals in our churches, teachers, lawyers, kept organizing around this. And in 2012, President Obama, I will say, because for many, many times he said he was not allowed to do this. This was not sheerly because it was from the good of his heart. This was really an organizing effort. Finally announced DACA. And DACA would have applied to students like me. This meant it applied to students who entered the U.S. before they were 16, who were under 30 the day that this was announced, who had never gotten into serious trouble with the law. They could apply for a permit and relief for deportation. One of my best friends that I met in undergrad, the best organizer that I knew, who I would tell you she's largely responsible for DACA, she had just turned 31. So she was not eligible. And she was so wonderful because this was a big sob, and after all of this work, it wasn't going to apply to her. But yet she still said we needed a win. So right away, you see so many students. Would have been me, but this happened when I was already a few years afterwards. And I had fortunately been able to adjust after many, 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 many years through a family member. If you haven't seen this paper yet, brought by HRI, on the backlog. My personal case took many, 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 many years because of the backlog. But suddenly, a lot of people had DACA. Currently, about a little over 700,000 individuals have at some point been DACA eligible. Now, does it help them? Does it help our families? Absolutely. But it also helps the United States. In Texas specifically, we've got 216,000 DACA eligible people, and together they've contributed $3.5 billion. They've earned $3.5 billion in total income, contribute $313 million in federal taxes, $282.5 million in state and local taxes. Now, most of the people, 65%, are in favor of legal status to DACA students, including a majority of Republicans. Something else happened a few years ago. What was that? Some Trump. Now, we are facing new challenges. Trump has tried to rescind DACA. Now, it is terrible to never have something. And now you've got hundreds of thousands of students who have been able to work. I now work at PepsiCo. We have DACA-eligible students at PepsiCo. My sister is now at Microsoft. There are DACA-eligible students in places like Microsoft. So President Trump tried to remove DACA. Fortunately, a court case said that he could not remove it from people who already had it, but it meant that a lot of people could no longer apply. So if you would have been eligible, but maybe you couldn't come up with the $495 application fee, or you, for some reason, and now we know why, were in fear of giving over this information to the government, and that's why you had resisted, you're out of luck. Because we're not accepting any new DACA applications. So here's where you come in. I read the list of individuals who had testified in favor of the in-state tuition law that let me and my sister go to college and has changed the entire life of my family. People like you also, we also need people like you to continue to contact your members of Congress, because sometimes they think that only people who look like me care about this issue. And you need to tell them that that's not true, that this is important to you, that this affects people that you know, that this affects people who go to church with you, that this affects your neighbors, and that this is something that immigration reform and DACA is something that is going to impact who you cast your ballot for. With that, I will conclude my remarks to tell you that it matters. One piece of legislation impacts hundreds of thousands, millions of people. It's impacted mine and my whole family's. And there are a lot of kids right now who do not have the happy ending that I've had, which was to get sworn in downtown Dallas and take the oath of citizenship. That was my entire life's dream, and that came true for me. And I can't stop until it becomes true for the hundreds of thousands of DACA recipients. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have several questions here, and I see we're going to have plenty more. I hope y'all aren't in a big hurry to get out of here tonight. Okay. Question number 1, if you show up for a granted court date, can you pass the border successfully? And that's probably a question for you, Callie.
So the question is, if you showed up for a court date, could you come through the border? So under the Remain in Mexico policy, I think the question is, you waited, now you finally have your court date, what happens to you? So different things can happen, but generally speaking, a person's first court date is just their first court date. So if you think about like the criminal process, the first time somebody goes to court, is not when their case resolves, right? There's a bunch of stuff that happens, and then eventually there's either a plea or something goes to trial, right? And so almost every court experience, regardless of whether it's criminal court or civil court, is like that. The first time you show up is usually not the only time that you show up. And so that is the case in immigration court as well. So just because somebody comes to their first hearing doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have relief granted to them at that time. Eventually, hopefully that person will be able to have sort of what we would call a merits hearing, so like a substantive consideration of their case where they would be allowed to present evidence. It would be very difficult for somebody to do that without an attorney while living in a tent outside of a port of entry, but somebody would eventually have the opportunity to do that, and if they won their case, then they would be admitted into the United States.
Thank you. Is separating migrant children from their parents a crime under international law? Aha. Stump the panel. Okay.
I can say briefly that complaints have been made to international law organizations, so the UN and other, for example, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, about not only the separation of children from their families, but also some of the other policies that we talked about today. There was a hearing before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights just, I think, 2 weeks ago on these things. So certainly there are arguments being made about international law violations committed by the United States.
Thank you. Is wage theft a crime? And would a victim of wage theft be allowed to apply for a special visa?
I don't know about the special visa part, but the state legislature recently did pass a bill making wage theft a crime. I don't know about the visa part.
Okay.
And I know from experience that the Department of Labor will take those cases irrespective of the person's immigration status. The problem is undocumented workers are less inclined to bring those claims against employers who have not paid them.
Okay, thank you. Has there been an increase in asylum seekers in Florida?
I'm wondering if the reason for asking that question is whether people are trying to seek entry into the United States through water instead of through land. And I think that if you all know otherwise, please jump in. What I've been hearing from folks around the country is that because so many of these policies were very recently they were held up in the courts until very recently. The legal service providers are just now trying to understand exactly what's going on. For example, the Customs and Border Protection Director was interviewed in Florida, actually randomly related to this question, last week on Tuesday, I think, and that was the point at which he said that third country travel ban, the IFR, was going into effect this week. We've heard providers with scattered reports that it's already been in effect, and so it's just sort of an example of some of the confusion. It's very hard to understand how a lot of this is playing out in real time.
What is the influence of the privately run prisons on the number of unlawful immigrants who are detained and imprisoned?
The private detention industry, I will call it, is rampant. And I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Seattle, and unbeknownst to me, there was a presentation at the lunch hour about the Boeing field, which used to be the main airport in the Seattle area, but it's now an ancillary airport, how Boeing Field has become instrumental in flights from Brownsville, Texas, McAllen, Texas, to Boeing Field in Seattle, because there is a for-profit detention facility outside of Seattle, between Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. And that in order to keep its 800-bed facility full at all times, because that's the mandate that the facility has, there are flights daily from South Texas up to Boeing Field in order to keep that detention facility full. So it's an insidious, pernicious, in my view, element of this whole complex of detention and crossing the lines with for-profit industry. I asked my retirement portfolio person the other day, do I have any mutual funds that represent and he says, you probably do, unfortunately.
This article in the New York Times about how undocumented immigrants are bolstering it with billions of dollars because there are fake social security numbers, so it gets withheld but not sent to this person. Now, the second one, I know because this would happen to my mom, but it takes a lot of guts. There is a way to eventually, if you adjust your status and then you have worked with the wrong social security, fake social security number, and then you are given a social security number, if you go to the Social Security Administration, you can request that they send the funds, but my mother kept every single tax return she ever filed with the other number, and that's why they did it for her. So I don't know, number one, how many people are keeping all those tax returns and how many people are gutsy enough to show up to a government building and say, all these years I used this social security number and you need to match them. But she had just retired in October, and she is receiving Social Security.
Great. Rebecca, I'm curious, did she have any legal representation, or she just go by herself to Social Security?
She went by herself. I'm not recommending it for everybody, but this is what she did.
Wow.
So yes.
That took courage.
She either did it in Austin or Georgetown, Texas. And prior to going, she did speak to an attorney who told her that she could do this.
Okay, great.
But I'll let one of the lawyers talk about the legal process. I just know this because she went through it.
During the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986 and 87, when there was a so-called amnesty program, it was widely known that people could untangle their Social Security histories of payments. And that process was available to a lot of people, and a lot of people did take advantage of it. Since then, however, the Social Security, it's called the Suspense Fund, has grown and grown and grown as people use Social Security numbers that are not their own. And so, to some extent, I think all of us who are native born are going to benefit from that accumulated suspense fund, because it keeps growing and growing and growing as people use numbers that are not their own, and that money nevertheless is in the Social Security system.
Thank you. Do we have a place where, quote unquote, welcome bags of essential goods can be donated?
I'm so excited for this question. Okay, so HRI serves, as I mentioned, asylum seekers, unaccompanied kids, and people who have survived crimes or undocumented and qualify for a U visa or protection under the Violence Against Women Act. We saw that chart before about the work authorization. So for many people seeking asylum, that 180 days doesn't kick in to like a year and a half after they're here, because they have to wait to get all that evidence to submit with their application. It's very time consuming. During that time, folks cannot work. So at HRI, for our clients, we have an assistance program where our clients can come in and pick up sort of basic need toiletries once a month that they need: toilet paper, toothpaste, shampoo, conditioner, all the sort of stuff that you might pick up at CVS is available sort of in a supply closet. Diapers, a lot of our clients need. So we do collections, and we work with churches and other organizations who do drives within their own members, and then are generous enough to bring those materials to us, and we're so appreciative for them. So I'll make a plug for HRI. There are certainly other organizations that provide services like that to their clients as well, and so I'm sure Catholic Charities has a similar program, but certainly we would be very excited to receive your donations at HRI.
Okay, this is a long one. What is the approximate number of countries that are considered safe, including Canada and the United States, for immigrants to seek asylum and/or citizenship?
So the only safe third country agreement that existed between the United States and another country until like 5 months ago was with Canada.
Okay. And/or, let's see. But there's a second part to it, right?
Yeah, a
lot, like the European countries. Yeah.
I think part of the other consideration is how a person can physically get to that country. So, for example, a person who, as an example of a client travel story, frequently many of our clients from African countries are able to secure a travel visa to somewhere in Central America, which then allows them to fly to that country and then travel up through Central America to the U.S. southern border. There are other countries that people can fly to without a visa, but certainly it's not every country. And so part of the question is not only whether a country is safe, and I don't know the exact answer to your question, how many countries those would be, but also how you might be able to physically access that country.
Okay. All right. Based on the U.S. news media, I am under the impression that these countries don't get as many seekers as Canada and the United States. Why is that?
Well, it would be entirely my own speculation because I'm not familiar with exactly which countries those would be. But I would say that things that would impact it would be whether people would be able to secure travel visas to somewhere that they could then either travel across land or ocean to get to if they are unable to go through sort of a refugee process in their own country.
Okay. Why don't more seekers try to get into safe countries geographically closer to their home countries?
Well, I think they do. The European Union has been deluged with asylum seekers. The other day we had a delegation from the World Affairs Council, and several of the people were from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and that was the very week that the administration announced the 18,000 number, and they were just aghast, and they said, how is it that the United States is only going to accept 18,000? We in Sweden have accepted over 1 million. We in Germany have accepted millions. So I think they do get to countries that are closer to their countries of origin, and countries in the European Union, of course, have been accepting them.
Sorry, trying to read handwriting here. Do you engage with local activist groups such as North Texas Dream Team or organizations like RACES for mutually beneficial dialogue, such as program/outreach? And okay, that's for you. Why don't you go ahead and answer that?
Yes, we had members from the North Texas Dream Team on our task force of 85 people that I mentioned to you, and also RAICES. There were several people from RAICES who were on our task force as well, and they are partners in our citizenship efforts as well. So definitely we are tied in with those organizations and many others.
Okay, thank you. This is for Callie, I guess. Has the path to citizenship always been this difficult? And if not, what has driven this intensity in restrictions? And can they be eased through legislation?
So I wish Bill was here because he just did an amazing presentation that outlined sort of the history of immigration law over time. I think what I will say, and I would be excited for either of you to add to this, is that there was a law passed in the 90s, IRA, right? Mm-hmm. There was a law passed in the 90s that is shortened to IRA that made, that put in place a lot more barriers for people who are trying to access permanent residence in the United States to be able to access that. So certainly this is not a new problem. It's exacerbated by policy decisions that various administrations have made. The backlog that we didn't really talk about very much, but is basically sort of the stack of papers that your application is going to wait in, oftentimes for years, is a result in part of not having enough staff persons to be able to adjudicate those applications. That's a policy problem. So there are things that can be cured just from a policy standpoint, and there are certainly lots of things that can be cured with legislation.
I'd like to weigh in from the personal part. Okay, so how many of you have heard, that person, they just haven't become a citizen because they don't want to? Because why didn't that person apply? He or she is married to a citizen. Heard anything like that? Okay, so do we remember from Callie's presentation the 3 boxes? The permanent status, the second one, the visitor one, and the no status. So something people don't realize is that if you are in the no status category, number one, like you crossed over without a visa and you marry a citizen and you have 2 little kids, there's no path for you. So it's not like, this just takes long. It doesn't exist. I mean, there might be asterisks if someone is severely sick, but for the most part, there is no path for someone who crossed without permission. Number 2, we have what are called per country quotas. So if you are from a country that doesn't get a lot of applications for a green card, you are likely to be granted permanent status much sooner than if you're from a country that receives a lot of applications. Now, once you think about those two, then there are preferences. So if you are a minor child of a U.S. citizen, there's a different, from insert a country, there's a different line, there's a different process, a different timetable than if you are, let's say, a child of a permanent resident, and if you are, for example, a sibling of someone from the Philippines, it's going to take over 25 years for you to get through this process legally.
I think the long and short of that is that this concept that there's a line that you get in, and it's a fair line, and for every country it's the same line, and for every family relationship it's the same line, is just not the case. It's just not the case. There is not a logical, as we would like to assume there is, process for getting in line and waiting your term out.
Okay. This is going to require an opinion type answer, not facts. So y'all are going to have an opinion. Why does the presence of immigrants in our country and in other countries around the world arouse so much hostility in so many people?
My short answer is an unfounded fear.
And my short answer is that I think that for very purposeful reasons, there have been campaigns to pit different categories of working class people against each other for a very, very long time. Nativism as sort of a concept, in the United States, shows up over and over and over as a political tool to a political end. And so it is, generally speaking, immigrants are part of a group of people who have limited political power in the traditional sense because there is not a right to vote for non-citizens. Immigrant communities have tremendous political power, tremendous economic power, tremendous power in our communities, but I think from a sort of, I guess, political standpoint, does not carry the right to vote. Well, an undocumented immigrant who is not a green card holder or a person who's a temporary visa holder. There are, of course, many immigrants who do hold the right to vote because they are U.S. citizens. But all that to say, my short answer is because of racism and because it's politically expedient to use that racism as a political weapon.
Okay. Having said all that, there is hope. I'm second generation, and my family remembers when we were discriminated against. And eventually you do get assimilated because this is a welcoming country, basically. So there is hope. We don't, my family we take it for granted now, but our ancestors remember what it was like. Are there any other questions?
I'm conscious of the fact that we've gone over our time, and I thank every one of you for coming tonight and for your patience and staying a little longer than perhaps you expected. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause to the panel. And